How are you, Lloyd? Good. Got everything you need?
Oh, I think I can give you an hour's worth of talking points. You ready? Sure, I want to
See Rick Schlazio?
The subcommittee will come to order. Welcome to the Ways and Means Subcommittee on Tax Policy, hearing on post-tax evaluation of recently expired tax provisions. Before we get started, I'd like to yield to the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Kevin Brady, for the purposes of an opening statement. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Buchanan, for holding this important hearing and for your leadership of the Tax Policy Subcommittee. And thank you to all of our witnesses for being here as well. We're here today to begin charting a new path forward on temporary tax provisions. In Washington, they call them tax extenders. For too many years before our historic tax reform, the approach to handling these provisions has centered around what works for Washington, not what works for the American people. In many cases, these tax extenders were a symptom of a much larger problem, our nation's outdated and uncompetitive tax code. High tax rates often drove both the supply and the demand of these short-term provisions. So rather than allowing our families and our job creators to keep more of their income up front, Washington forced them to rely on these credits, these exclusions and exemptions for short-lived relief. Meanwhile, the real problem, our nation's broken tax code, went unaddressed and grew worse. That's no longer the case. Today we have a new tax code that's modern, competitive, and built for growth. We have lowered tax rates for Americans of all income levels and businesses of all sizes. We've taken unprecedented action to encourage and reward investment throughout our economy, not just for a few industries, but for all. We've delivered one of the most competitive tax systems in the world, leveling the playing field for our businesses and workers across the globe, and more importantly, here at home. So the question now is, with all the outstanding features of our new tax code, do we need to keep temporary provisions that are a relic of the old broken system? That's the question we're going to begin answering today as we move ahead with a new forward-looking approach on tax extenders that aligns with the principles and priorities of America's new pro-growth tax code. So starting right now, we're going to apply a rigorous test to these temporary provisions. We're going to take a close look at each of them, asking ourselves and our witnesses, are these provisions truly needed in a modern tax code? Do they amplify and complement the growth and competitiveness provided by our new tax system? And if the answer is yes, what other tax provisions are stakeholders willing to give up to make the extenders a permanent or a long-term part of our tax code? We built a new tax code for the long term. Temporary measures are rarely good tax policies. Those that don't pass these tests should be eliminated so we can continue our ongoing work to improve America's tax code, making it even more pro-growth and even simpler. This is Congress's opportunity to end business as usual with these tax extenders and find a way forward for permanence and long-term status for those that remain. I challenge committee members on both sides of the aisle to view these with fresh eyes. Let's work together to continue to craft the fairest and most competitive tax code in the world. Once again, I thank you, Chairman Buchanan, for calling this important hearing today, and I look forward to working together with all of you to continue our work of delivering a fair, simpler tax code. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last year, Congress enacted the most comprehensive and sweeping rewrite of the tax laws in over 3 decades. With our modern pro-growth tax code now in place, we need to turn our focus to maintaining it and making further refinements and enhancements. We don't want to wait another 30 years for the next tax reform. Instead, our ongoing focus will be on continuing to make improvements to the tax code to promote growth, promote fairness and simplicity for all taxpayers. Today, we take an important step in that process by beginning to evaluate the set of provisions which have been renewed so frequently that they are most often called tax extenders. Contrary to our focus in tax reform on providing broad tax benefits for all taxpayers like rate reduction, full expensing, many of these expired provisions are targeted very narrowly to encourage certain activity for certain industries. Following our historic reforms, it should not be business as usual with respect to tax extenders. Now is the time to examine each one of these provisions one by one to determine whether and how they fit into the new tax code. That means taking a hard look at whether each provision provides value to the American taxpayer. For each provision, we will ask, what role does this provision play in the new tax code? If it's no longer needed because of the reforms that have been enacted, the provision should be eliminated. If the provision continues to play an important role in enhanced pro-growth tax reform, we should consider making it permanent. And in that case, we will ask those who benefit from the provision to consider what other tax benefits they'd be willing to forego in favor of having this provision made a permanent part of the tax code. To that end, we open the door of the subcommittee on tax policy to all stakeholders or groups interested in testifying on these provisions that were in effect through 2017 and are now expired. Over 20 individuals and groups have took us up on the offer. We are now looking forward to hearing from 4 panels of witnesses testifying today about these provisions and their roles in the new tax code in order to help us answer the key question I've laid out. Without further ado, let's get to it. I now yield to the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Doggett, for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to working with you on getting a rigorous review of all of these provisions. This is a rather unusual hearing. Indeed, I suppose any hearing on taxes in this committee is unusual since we went through a period over the last year plus where it was deemed easier to pass bills without public hearings than with them, and to minimize public participation, including the participation of those who are affected most directly by various tax provisions, and of course to never hold the administration accountable by having any of its officials come and testify about their position on these measures. As Mr. Brady alluded to in his opening remarks, he actually told us that the enactment of the Republican tax law would make extenders unnecessary. He said he would be, quote, ensuring that we will no longer have to spend months each year debating temporary tax extensions. Of course, in prior years, we haven't really spent months debating them. Often they've been included with must-pass legislation at the end of the year, really questioning whether they provided very much incentive and certainly without very much oversight. In 2009, I was successful in getting provisions added to the extender bill that year requiring careful cost-benefit analysis of each extender. It never was implemented in fact. Today's hearing really seems to be focusing mainly on the leftovers and the left-outs, what was not deemed of sufficient value to include in the new tax law. We know that while we have the kind of open hearing process that should have been the process used during consideration of the tax law, that if we extended all 26 provisions that are the subject of the hearing, the cost over a decade would be a little over $90 billion. While that's nothing to ignore, it pales in comparison with the more than $2 trillion involved in the original tax law adopted without specific hearings. I hope that what we will see out of this hearing and the resulting process is that we either include tax provisions in permanent law or we eliminate them. The idea of leaving people year to year, not only questioning whether they're extended but suspended, is really not fair. And it also reduces any incentive value that any of these provisions may have. Certainly there's little incentive associated with retroactively applying a tax extender. I am particularly interested in hearing this afternoon from a number of witnesses in Panel 3. I'm interested in hearing all the witnesses, but in Panel 3, who will focus on the broader impact of these provisions and how they tie in with the tax law we've already passed. I think some are obvious for elimination, such as the racehorse provision. Some present closer questions. Indeed, there's the energy panel we're about to hear from. What a contrast between the way tax breaks were handled for fossil fuels, none of which were touched, one of which was actually expanded so that multinational oil companies would pay even less tax on income they earn abroad than other multinationals, but it has been many of the renewable energy provisions that have been left with uncertainty. If these merit inclusion or extension, if they merit extension, they merit inclusion on a permanent basis in the tax code. So I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, as we evaluate all of these provisions, consider their overall impact, and I hope that this hearing will not be the last in looking at the implications of tax policy for our economy and the impact of what, in fact, happened as a result of last year's legislation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett. Now it's my pleasure to welcome our first panel of the day. Our first panel is focused on expired tax incentive pertaining to energy efficiency. First, we'll hear from the Honorable Rick Lazio, Senior Vice President of Alliance Group. Mr. Lazio served in Congress 93 to 2000. Welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And we are delighted to have him appearing before us today. Second, we'll hear from Henry Chamberlain, President and Chief Operating Officer of the Builders, Owners, and Managers Association International. Third, we'll hear from Daniel Pizzette, Vice President for Policy and Research at Alliance to Save Energy. Fourth, we'll hear from Lisa Jacobson, President of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy. Finally, we welcome Sam Purcell, Chief Executive Officer of Zero Motorcycles, Inc. Thank you again for being here today and taking the time. The committee has received each of your written statements, and they will be made part of the formal hearing record. Each of you will be recognized for 3 minutes for oral remarks. Mr. Lazio, you are recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Doggett. Good to see so many old friends and colleagues, and also recognize Chairman Brady, who was here earlier. I'm going to try and get right to the point here. The provision that I addressed today encourages the building of energy-efficient commercial and government buildings. It's referenced in 179, Section 179D of the tax code. I'd like to recognize the strong support of Congressman Reed of this committee and Congressman Reichert, as well as Congressman Blumenauer. And on the Senate side, Senators Cardin and Portman have been doing yeoman's work on this area of legislation. According to the Department of Energy, about 36% of all electricity, that's $4 out of every $10 just about in this country, and 1/5 of all energy is consumed by commercial buildings. The cost of electricity is a significant and a growing burden on both businesses and government, also known as a taxpayer, with taxpayers now shouldering about $10 billion a year for state and local government energy usage. That's the operating costs that are built in as a result of, in many cases, excess energy usage. In short, encouraging energy-efficient buildings significantly supports the policy goals of energy independence, while at the same time reducing costs for both businesses and for taxpayers. Mr. Chairman, I speak to you today as the Senior Vice President of Alliance Group. This is a national tax services firm that helps businesses qualify for 179D. I'm sharing my perspective on behalf of the company, which has a national perspective, working with thousands of companies across the nation. In fact, many entities speaking today are members of the 179D coalition, of which Alliance Group is a proud member. My answer to those who ask fairly, why do we need a tax break to encourage the building of energy-efficient buildings, is the following 4 things. 1, the benefits from energy efficiency have a long horizon. They are often not captured in making decisions about costs and funding for buildings, and rarely are they part of underwriting or fairly reflected in underwriting in terms of financing. Second, a recognition that energy-efficient design leads to greater energy independence. Third, our need to continue to encourage energy-efficient design and maintain our leadership in this field. And fourth, this incentive helps provide and encourage designers, whether it's architects, engineers, or other contractors, to spend time, unbillable time, to develop cutting-edge technologies that lead to lower operating costs, ultimately leading to savings for taxpayers. There are 5 specific points I would like to encourage the committee to consider based on Alliance Group's years of experience with incentive. These are recommendations for the committee. Number 1, raise the benchmark ASHRAE standard every time on a regular basis. Make it a reoccurring upgrade of that standard. Push designers to continue to innovate, to do better, and to do more. My company, Alliance Group, worked with Congress in 2015 when we did the PATH Act to upgrade it. It needs to continue to be upgraded. Quickly, if I can move through this, in small businesses,
We're going to have to try to hold to 3 minutes because we've got 20-some witnesses today. So
Sure, Mr.
if you
Chairman.
could just wrap up 5 seconds or so if there's anything.
Sure. I have the other recommendations that I have. I'm going to submit for the record, Mr. Chairman. There are things I think we can positively do to improve this provision, saves taxpayers money, makes the country more competitive, and I believe it's worthy of the committee's support.
Thank you, Mr. Lazio. Mr. Chamberlain, you're recognized.
Yeah, Chairman Buchanan, Ranking Member Doggett, and members of the committee, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to testify today on the importance of extending and ultimately making permanent the commercial building energy efficient tax deduction, commonly referred to as 179D. I'm speaking today on behalf of the Building Owners and Managers Association International, where I serve as President Chief Operating Officer. BOEM International is a federation of 88 U.S. local associations and 18 international affiliates. We represent the owners and managers of all commercial property types. BOEM is a longtime supporter of 179D, and we've been actively working with members of Congress to extend this important incentive since its original enactment in 2005. 179D offers building owners a deduction of up to $1.80 a square foot for energy-efficient improvements made to certain building systems. Buildings must be independently certified to receive this deduction. By providing a financial incentive, the tax deduction helps real estate owners who might not otherwise have the necessary capital to make the decision to design, retrofit, and operate energy-efficient structures. These upgrades are particularly necessary for older building stock. 179D promotes private sector solutions to improve energy efficiency and modernize the built environment. We continue to applaud these efforts, but more can be done. Currently, 179D is the only federal tax incentive for office and industrial buildings to enhance their energy efficiency. A recent study commissioned by BOMA, along with other members of the coalition to extend and improve the 179D tax deduction, highlights the costs and benefits of extending and modernizing the incentive. The study estimates that as many as 77,000 jobs will be created and $7.4 billion will be added annually to the national GDP with a long-term extension. The biggest barrier for our members in utilizing this incentive is the historical short-term nature of its extension. The recent short-term or retroactive extensions don't account for real estate's planning horizons, which are generally 3 to 5 years for a capital investment. Even when the deduction was extended for 5 years between 2009 and 2013, by the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008, the recession made these investments very difficult. And by the time the industry found itself on a stronger financial footing, the extension was set to expire again. BOMA's members are committed to making sound energy efficiency investments that not only make business sense, but also help improve sustainability efforts. 179D has the potential to do just that. We believe that 179D will be fully utilized if the incentive is made permanent and coupled with moderate reforms that would increase the incentive amount. This will result in more energy-efficient commercial properties across the country. Thank you for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Chamberlain. Mr. Brissett, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Doggett, and members of the subcommittee. The Alliance to Save Energy is a nonprofit bipartisan coalition of business, government, environmental, and consumer interest leaders that advocates for policies that grow the economy while reducing energy consumption. The Alliance enjoys the support of more than 120 businesses and organizations, as well as 15 members of Congress who serve as honorary advisors, including Representative Reichert. Today, the United States realizes twice as much GDP per unit of energy consumed when compared to 1980. That is tremendous progress, and tax incentives aligned with critical energy efficiency policies have played an important part in getting us there. But now is not the time to stop. The United States still fails to capture about 2/3 of the energy we produce, which means more waste and higher costs for homeowners and businesses. 3 tax incentives that help reduce that waste and lower energy costs have expired. The Alliance supports immediate, forward-looking extensions of these incentives that were extended through the end of last year. Section 25C, the non-business energy property credit for existing homes, provides an incentive for homeowners to choose more energy-efficient products. The Energy Department has estimated that if this credit were extended for 10 years, household energy bills would be reduced by more than $13 billion. Section 45L, the Energy Efficient Home Credit, provides an incentive to home builders to construct more energy-efficient homes. homebuyers realize savings from lower energy bills that pay off in just a few years. This tax credit has had a market transformational effect. When it was enacted, less than 1% of new homes qualified, but now that proportion is about 10%. Section 179D, the commercial building tax deduction, provides an incentive for energy efficiency improvements in commercial multifamily buildings. One recent analysis estimates that renewing 179D with certain modifications would create up to 77,000 jobs and contribute over $7 billion to U.S. GDP. In the longer term, the Alliance urges Congress to consider improvements to the provisions to drive investment and deliver even greater savings. In principle, the Alliance supports the enactment of improved tax incentives that are simple and straightforward to understand and access, strong enough to drive investments and affect behavior, minimize free ridership, and are reasonable in terms of cost when compared to the potential for savings. Two bills are representative of modifications that would deliver even greater energy cost savings to homeowners and businesses. H.R. 3507, introduced by Representative Reichert, proposes to permanently extend 179D and require the Treasury Department to issue regulations to encourage greater use by governmental and nonprofit entities. And S. 1068, the Clean Energy for America Act, introduced by Senator Ron Wyden, would go further and address new and existing homes as well. It also proposes an alternative, performance-based approach to encourage deeper retrofits and greater savings. Other modifications beyond those proposed in these two bills might also be necessary. The Alliance stands ready to support the subcommittee in its efforts to move energy efficiency tax incentives forward. Thank you for your consideration. I'd be glad to answer any questions today or later for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Brezep. Ms. Jacobson, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee. The Business Council for Sustainable Energy is a coalition of companies and trade associations representing the energy efficiency, natural gas, and renewable energy sectors. On behalf of the Council, I would like to express our appreciation for the steps Congress has taken to enact the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. Of note, the Bipartisan Budget Act included the extension of a number of clean energy tax measures that the coalition has long supported. We thank you very much. And while these actions have been very positive for many of our industry members, I need to highlight that there are still some technologies from industry sectors that are now at an even larger competitive disadvantage. Tax incentives in the energy sector should be structured such that the benefits are provided to all qualifying technologies in accordance with their energy, environmental, and other public benefits. Additionally, it is important that tax policies are established over a sufficient duration to provide investors with the confidence they need to proceed with major investments. The recent market dynamism in the U.S. energy sector is partly credited to tax policy frameworks that have benefited some, but not all, clean energy technologies. Importantly, the Bipartisan Budget Act provided a long-term extension for the non-solar investment tax credit technologies, which include fuel cells, combined heat and power, small wind, and geothermal. The Council commends the committee for this action. However, other technologies have not benefited from the same long-term tax policies. In the renewable energy sector, these technologies include biomass, geothermal, landfill gas, waste-to-energy, hydropower, marine, and hydrokinetic. While these technologies provide valuable renewable energy 24/7, they also take longer to reach construction. Consequently, these non-wind PTC Section 45 technologies cannot take advantage of the tax credits that are only extended for a few weeks or a year at a time. This uncertainty has created adverse market conditions. It is more difficult for projects of expired technologies to secure financing because banks value the security of investing in projects with a long-term tax credit. It also can be difficult for new and existing projects of expired technologies to secure power purchase agreements. This is because the extended technologies can offer better value. Representative Stefanik has introduced H.R. 4137, the Renewable Electricity Tax Credit Equalization Act, which would address this inequity. I'm pleased to associate myself and the coalition with the Alliance to Save Energy's remarks on energy efficiency. We strongly support modifications and extension to 179D, 25C, 45L. In the transportation sector, 30B fuel cell electric vehicle credit and the 30C alternative fuel vehicle infrastructure credit should also be considered. And then finally, energy storage should receive consideration. The Energy Storage Incentive and Deployment Act, H.R. 4649, should be considered by this committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Peischel, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm here to ask you to extend the Section 30D provisions for consumer tax credits for 2- and 3-wheel plug-in vehicles. My name is Sam Peischel, and I am the CEO of Zero Motorcycles. In the past 11 years, we've grown from a garage startup to the largest manufacturer of performance 2-wheel plug-in vehicles in the United States and an internationally respected brand. We manufacture and assemble all of our motorcycles in our offices in Santa Cruz, California, where we employ 150 people directly and rely on more than 70 domestic suppliers in 25 states across the United States. I'm also testifying on behalf of a coalition of manufacturers in our industry. Arcimoto is a member of our coalition, and following their NASDAQ listing this last August, this startup 3-wheel manufacturer built a new facility creating a variety of new jobs to fill their 2,000-unit backorder. In addition, Zero's approximately 100 dealers have businesses and districts that overlap with nearly every member of this subcommittee, including HAP Cycles in Congressman Buchanan's district and AAT Power Sports in Congressman Brady's district. I'd like to convey 4 key points regarding this tax credit. Number 1, the credit gets us and U.S. consumers over a key hurdle. Consumers are consistently measuring the balance of performance and price, and over the past 8 years, we've dramatically increased all of the performance metrics of the vehicle while holding the price relatively constant. The price-value gap between plug-in and internal combustion is the final hurdle, and this credit helps us and American consumers to clear it. Number 2, this is a critical time. The success of Tesla in the 4-wheel space has brought visibility, but sales in the 2- and 3-wheel space have been slower. At the same time, we're seeing an expansion of entrants from countries with significant subsidies for plug-in vehicles in the EU and China and India. The next few years will be when the market dynamics will solidify and international leaders in this specific industry will emerge. Because of the timing, this credit will not only create new jobs, it can set the foundations for a new American industry. And number 3, we are not a powerful or well-connected special interest, we're just a coalition of small American businesses. Because we are subscale and have not yet reached profitability, we are unfortunately not able to benefit from the recently passed and incredibly beneficial corporate tax cuts that are driving most American businesses forward. And 4, it's an incredibly efficient spend. The fact that we're small businesses and we currently have small volumes means that the cost of the government and the taxpayers remains small, while the impact on thousands of American jobs and an emerging American industry can be massive. For us, the clock is ticking. Our peak season is around the corner, and because of this, we respectfully urge you to act quickly to extend this within your deliberations. I can tell you firsthand, you have an opportunity here to do something that will change the lives of the Americans that are trying to build the next generation of 2- and 3-wheel vehicles that are built here in the United States. Republicans and Democrats who devote themselves every day to the hard work of building a business and building the foundations of a new American industry. And we would truly appreciate your support. Thank you.
I want to thank all of you for your testimony. We'll now proceed to questions and answer session. Due to the high volume of witnesses today at this hearing, we have agreed that each member will have 3 minutes to question the witness on each panel. I'll defer my question to the end of the question period. I now recognize Mr. Roscom. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Jacobson, I appreciated your kind words about the clean energy initiatives in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and the Bipartisan Budget Act. I wanted to pick up something that you mentioned at the very end of your oral remarks, and those were about the waste-to-energy credits. So I represent a constituency in suburban Chicago. There's a company called Graphic Packaging that does a great job in terms of recycling, and everybody knows intuitively that incentivizing recycling is a good thing. There's no argument about that, and they employ 300 people. Here's an observation about what's been happening, though, in that there could be some elements of the, if left unattended, Section 45 can create an incentive that instead of waste or recycling being diverted to recyclables being diverted to recycling facilities, recycling can be mixed in with garbage and then burned and so forth, which there's nobody with a straight face, you, me, nobody is interested in seeing that. Can you speak to, how it is that we can be wise about this to make sure that recycling is being set aside for a recycling stream and not inadvertently being burned for energy?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the question. I mean, I think the tax issues related to waste to energy I'm going to answer just very briefly separately, but the first part, you know, I've had the pleasure to work with this industry for a good number of years. I can only share my assessment and what I have heard from the industry, but I know for a number of the companies we work with, they have very strong data to show that in waste to energy facilities, they do very well with regard to percentages of recycling. In fact, improved percentages in areas where they don't have waste to energy facilities. I'm happy to get you data on that. The Energy Recovery Council is an excellent resource. They are one of our members, and they represent the industry. I think in terms of the tax issues to waste to energy and the other 45 technologies, as I mentioned, the way the tax credit has been structured doesn't fit their business cycle. For waste to energy, many of them are owned by municipal organizations. I mean, these are basically local governments, and they operate on a very different timeline than these credits have been in place. So we need a long-term extension so local governments can really do what their communities want. And with regard to waste to energy facilities, if that's, you know, right now that has not been on the table because we've not had a workable credit. So we certainly hope for all the 45 technologies that the committee will consider a long-term extension that's mindful of their business cycle. So thank you very much for the question, and again, I'm happy to follow up with more specific information from the Energy Recovery Council or for others.
That's great. Thank you for your insight. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Roscom. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Doggett, for a question he might have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chamberlain, you described some improvements that you would like to see in 179D. The estimate we have is that simply renewing it in its current form would cost about $69 million for last year. Are the improvements that you're seeking going to increase the cost of the credit or the provision, or will it be the same? And if so, about how much more will it cost to do your version?
Thank you for the question. Number one, what we'd like to see is the incentive. We'd like it to be permanent. We think the 179D should be made permanent so we can plan with our business cycles and all the rest. The 180 is a lower level than we think it's the threshold for to get these projects really going, so we would ask for it to be increased to $3 a foot going forward, and as part of a permanency. We'd also like to see, if possible, that we made a transferable tax credit, so all the businesses can use it, including the REITs. I don't have the specific financial impact on that, but those would be the three things that we'd like to see addressed.
Can you get us that impact?
We can certainly get data for you.
And I believe both you and Mr. Lazio tied this to the standards of the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning, that the goal here is to continue to up the standard over time. Do you both believe that it's important, if this provision is continued in permanent law, that that be part of it?
I would say, Congressman, absolutely, that we want to challenge designers to push themselves to continue to improve these designs and improve the efficiency of these buildings and lower operating costs. Originally, the bill had a 2001 ASHRAE standard. Then it was revised to 2007 in the PATH Act, and we believe not only should it be upgraded and revised regularly, but there ought to be something in the legislation that continually upgrades and raises the bar in terms of energy efficiency, which would raise efficiency level, lower costs for governments, and that, of course, gets passed through to the taxpayers. So ultimately, it saves taxpayers dollars.
I don't see that in the legislation that you endorsed, any steady increase in the standard, but you believe it should be part of anything that we approve.
Yes, Congressman. It is in my submitted testimony, my written testimony, and I would be happy to expand on that.
I have a number of businesses, perhaps members of your association in San Antonio and Austin, that are part of a group called 2030 that is seeking to achieve zero carbon emissions by 2030. Should that be a consideration in this credit?
I think energy efficiency should absolutely be a consideration, and we should be setting goals such as carbon neutral if we can and all the rest. But I think we need to realize that those are goals, and for an existing building stock, back to ASHRAE 90.1, it's already difficult to achieve that for existing buildings. When you go from 2001 to 7, the efficiency went up 15%. So when you look at the deductions, the partial deductions of the 60 cents a foot that's in the current 179D provision, people target that on lighting and some of the other things, and there's value in that. But I think we should realize that for an existing building, ASHRAE, it's a good benchmark, but it's already difficult to achieve a lot of buildings.
So do you support including the goal of going, is it from 2001 to 2007 standard?
I think ASHRAE is a good benchmark for us to use as a target. We just realize that it is difficult for many buildings to achieve that, and the partial deductions we think are important as part of the
As you both get us some cost figures on what additional cost there would be, it would be useful to know exactly what increased standards you think would be most appropriate.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for your testimony.
Mr. Reichert, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. Section 179 has put money back into the hands of businesses to invest in the economy by providing deduction to offset the cost of energy-efficient improvements to commercial and multifamily residential buildings. It has also helped building owners realize substantial savings on energy costs and created incentives for the research and development of new energy efficiency technologies. Mr. Brissett, can you discuss how 179 fits into the new tax code, please?
Could you say the last few words of your question again?
Could you discuss how Section 179 fits into the new tax code?
Oh, sure. So most of what we've talked about today involves Section 179D, but Section 179 also has had some expensing. The tax bill changed the way some pieces of equipment can be expensed. And what that does is it encourages replacements of pieces of equipment rather than just keeping older, less efficient equipment in place by using repairs. And generally speaking, over time, pieces of equipment become more efficient because of the Department of Energy's Appliance and Equipment Standards Program. So equipment that's being installed today will be more efficient almost by default when compared to previous equipment.
Could you just expand a little bit on the figures that you gave, 77,000 jobs and the increase in GDP, and
Yes.
how does that happen?
Sure.
It's obvious, but I'd like to get it on record.
Sure. And my written testimony in footnote number 4 includes the full citation to that analysis. The analysis was performed by the Regional Economic Models Incorporated, and it was published last May. The premise of those savings, REMI produced sort of 3 scenarios, 179D as it currently stands, and then 179D with certain modifications, including some of those that are part of HR 3507. The increase in GDP and the increase in jobs, I think, is tied to the increased economic activity around retrofitting buildings. 179D is a very powerful incentive, and so to the extent that you're doing more of these commercial retrofits, you're building sort of to higher standards, which was just discussed with the ASHRAE reference, you're doing more energy efficiency, and more energy efficiency is more jobs, because those are jobs that are generally local. They cannot be outsourced quite as much, and the energy efficiency sector is really quite diverse. My written testimony also includes district-by-district energy efficiency jobs for each of the members of the subcommittee today.
Right. Thank you for your answer. I yield back.
Mr. Larson, you're recognized.
And thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this this hearing as well. I think this is a great opportunity to hear from so many impacted industries. But as Mr. Doggett was saying at the outset, I think it's the cart before the horse, so to speak. We've already passed a bill that, unfortunately, and I think anytime we do things in haste without public hearings and without the kind of testimony that is required, and whether it's the Affordable Care Act, which I would argue we had a great deal of testimony on, or whether it's our most recent tax bill, it leaves an awful lot of unanswered questions. And so then we call a panel before us and ask you to decide whether or not credits should remain permanent or whether or not the tax relief that you received was bountiful enough so that you can get along on your own. And so I would just go down the panel, and I'll start with a former colleague, Mr. Lazio, to ask if he thinks that we need to consider extending more tax credits, or has this tax bill been sufficient in and of itself to deal with that?
Thank you, Congressman. Well, I guess the reason I'm here is to sort of say, yeah, there's some need to extend these temporary provisions and to provide, if possible, some permanency or some visibility. You'll get the best behavioral changes if you have the longer horizon, which I think was one of the guiding philosophies of the tax bill signed into law. In this case, these provisions,
especially with energy, the longer horizon view and the inconsistency with how we award or punish people, I think needs to be always reviewed with regard to the long horizon. Mr. Chamberlain, what would you add to that?
When we started this effort back in 2006, we were looking at energy independence. We're also looking at good business. I think it's if you make.
Are we any closer to energy independence?
No, but the energy efficiency goals. And we talk about ASHRAE 90.1 and the rest. It's important for us to keep pushing energy efficiency as part of this.
Why is their permanency important?
Businesses need to plan on certainty. They're going to go 3 to 5 years and longer. This allows us to bridge the gap between short-term investments around energy efficiency and then the owner's goals, which can be longer term. So
as Mr. Doggett pointed out earlier, do you feel left out or left over?
We feel left out. We'd like to see this made permanent, and we'd like to see it improved a little bit so that people can really leverage it up and take advantage.
Well, so would we, and I see my time is expiring. But Mr. Bissett?
Sure, I'll add 2 points. One, the federal government already implements a number of federal energy efficiency policies, including codes and standards, and it's helpful to have incentives in the tax code that are complementary to those, encouraging more efficient products and equipments to be installed, encouraging more efficient buildings to be built. The other thing that I'll add is energy efficiency generally supports affordability, resilience, and reliability across the energy sector. And I think those are important attributes as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rice, you're recognized.
Mr. Lazio, the particular improvements that you're talking about under 179D, it deals with heating and air conditioning units, water heaters, that type of thing, right? Lighting, that type of thing.
Correct, Congressman.
And it encourages what, less energy use?
Less energy use at the building envelope, so it could be the coating on the windows, it could be a different technology affecting, as you said, heating, air conditioning, the HVAC units, so it could be the skin, the air conditioning, or it could be the lighting. It could be more efficient lighting. In any of those, and a designer who is involved in providing specifications for those particular improvements, and it could be a new building or a retrofit. A lot of, as my colleagues were saying, a lot of the work is involved retrofits, that they whatever they do has to meet or exceed ASHRAE standards, usually 50% more than the current ASHRAE standard or the benchmark in order to get the full benefit of the $1.80 per square foot.
So, and this is not a credit, it's a deduction.
It's a deduction, correct. And
might these same things be deductible under some other section of the code?
Well, they could potentially be under with longer horizon, but it's the designer, in this case, when we're talking about public buildings, yes, for commercial buildings, the owner can do it. In the case of Section 4 of 179D, which deals only with allowing designers who improve public buildings. Of course, public buildings, there's no tax basis and there's no tax paid, so there's no value to the deduction of the credit, and so the law allows them to allocate that to the designer to incentivize them to improve their techniques in this space.
And have Mr. Chamberlain, is that what, I can't read your name tag.
Yes, Congressman.
Have you looked at the cost-benefit analysis of these, ignoring the credit, these various high-standard improvements? Do they pay for themselves?
They absolutely do over time. What we're trying to bridge is the short-term return that people are looking for with the actual long-term return on the investments in a lighting system or something else. This allows us to get that capital
But
invested.
with reduced energy cost,
Yes.
ignoring the credit, they pay for themselves.
Over time. What we're trying to do is bridge the gap between a short-term return on investment that gets an owner to invest in that property and a longer-term horizon on the return on that investment.
So governments are generally going to build energy-efficient buildings anyway. Private investors, if they get a return on it, they're going to invest in it anyway. Really, what we need to do with these preferences in the code is incentivize behavior that people wouldn't already do. Where I struggle here is, aren't people going to invest in these things anyway if they get a valid return, and aren't many of these things deductible anyway under other areas of the code?
Well, Congressman, the average private sector building in the U.S. is over 30 years old now, so there's a huge existing building stock out there that has another 34 years of useful life, and this deduction really goes to the ability to retrofit those buildings for really efficient and profitable futures.
Thank you, sir.
Ms. Del Bene, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all of you for your testimony, for being here with us this morning. As a former startup CEO and now as a member of Congress who has the honor of representing a very vibrant community of innovators and entrepreneurs, I had high hopes when we went into tax reform that we'd be having serious conversations about getting our fiscal house in order and reforming the tax code so we could support economic growth that's built to last. A tax code where skilled workers and innovative ideas can thrive in a stable business climate, where modern infrastructure and a world-class higher education system helps students to succeed, and where cutting-edge research creates breakthroughs and successful businesses. Accomplishing those things would have put our country on a path to long-term success and given every American that's been left behind the opportunity to make life better for themselves and for their families. But that's tough work that requires a sustained and bipartisan effort. Unfortunately, that's not what happened at all at the end of last year. Instead, my friends on the other side of the aisle rushed a bill to President Trump's desk for signature without meaningful public debate or analysis. And now here we are with open questions left about tax extenders, as well as all the unclear, hastily drafted provisions in the final law that our constituents and U.S. businesses are now struggling to understand, in many cases coming to us asking for corrections where the rush process resulted in mistakes. We were promised jobs and growth, but we've seen layoffs across the country, including from some of the Republican tax giveaways' most touted beneficiaries, companies like Carrier or Kimberly-Clark, just to name a few. Congress should not pick winners and losers in the economy, and we should strive for a code that provides certainty to taxpayers, certainty that many of you have talked about today. We should put an end to the cycle of retroactive extensions and jockeying over uncertain tax policies that make it impossible for hardworking families and small businesses to plan for the future. Many of you have brought up this concept of certainty and stability and return on investment. I think these are very important. When we talk about certainty and return, what's the time frame? I know, Ms. Jacobson, you talked about this as well. What's the time frame from starting with new technologies to getting through to having a sustainable business that you see for your companies?
Thank you very much for the question. I think one thing to understand is all of these industries are distinct businesses, and they have different business cycles. So some technologies can be implemented very quickly in, say, a 1 or 2 or 3 year timeline, but there are others where it could take 10 years to go from the initial origination of that project to construction and then actually fulfilling its ultimate objective. So I think the challenge with this conversation is that we can't look for a one-size-fits-all solution. When we look, and I'm speaking now from the energy and the sustainable transportation sectors, they all are distinct. But what we do know is the tax policy needs to be distributed in an equitable manner. We do not want Congress or other policymakers putting the thumb on the scale for any particular technology. So they need to be equitable, and they need to be consistent with their project cycles. So the longest opportunity, permanent or certainly multi-year extensions are very welcome.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Meehan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Representative Lazio, welcome back. And I'm particularly focused on the issue of 179D, your emphasis on the decisions that are made economically, but I look at what the impact of these kinds of credits, and can you give me your assessment of what a difference it makes, not in the shining, gleaming Class A towers that are coming up that everybody likes to see, but the recognition that in many areas, urban areas particularly, we see an aging housing stock. And the ability to get them back into a manner in which they can be utilized to keep the vibrancy of regions together is critical. And to the extent to which you can tell me that these kinds of incentives actually can make a difference in having that housing stock be retrofitted and once again contribute in a very competitive housing, business environment, which helps the sustenance of areas. And these aren't exclusively big city issues. It can be small urban areas like Scranton, Pennsylvania, as an example. Also, would you speak to the question of things like school districts who are struggling to find dollars, who may look at the necessity to say, if we're going to save taxpayer dollars, are we going to build a gleaming new high school, or are we going to go back and retrofit the one we have? And the extent to which those hundreds of thousands of dollars that could be saved will make not only an energy efficient building, but also the potential that those dollars can be reinvested in other kinds of things which are being shorted in education. Those are examples of why I think this thing is in place. Am I missing anything on that, or is this what we're looking for?
Well, Congressman, you are absolutely right, and you're making the right points. For example, recently we worked with a school district that, and a designer for a upgrade, a retrofit, that placed in geothermal energy plant in that school, saving it about $450,000 a year. That's $450,000 a year. That's less of a tax burden for the constituents. That's $450,000 more that potentially can be used to help with innovative teaching solutions in that school. And you're also right about housing across America. There are 5 million Americans that live in assisted housing in one way, form, or another. There are 3,400 public housing authorities throughout the country. Those are all public agencies. There's probably a $20 billion backlog in terms of capital expenses for the million two or so people that live in public housing, for example. This will allow for lower operating costs, more money freed up, and less pressure on the federal government, candidly, to come to the federal government to ask for more subsidy. So the idea is to make our housing stock more efficient, more productive, better cash flows, less burden on the taxpayer, less burden on the federal government. And we're finding, and I find this, I crisscross the country. We work in virtually every state in the country in helping small and mid-sized architects and engineers and contractors in this space to be able to use their talents to provide for this efficiency, lowering operating costs and lowering overall energy dependence and saving taxpayers' dollars. And it's a win all the way around.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Blumenauer, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this discussion. I am a little frustrated that we had about 1 day to jam through the largest transfer of wealth in our nation's history. I made the point repeatedly during that hearing that people didn't know what they were doing, and we were going to find all sorts of surprises. And sadly, that's been the case. Tax-free farming, we're finding out, buried in the bill. But this is a serious conversation. It's a type of prioritization we should have been doing all along. As Mr. Lazio mentioned, I've been deeply involved with the provisions here of 179D. It makes sense. And in part, Mr. Rice's point about doesn't this, on the long run, pay for itself, it's true. But unfortunately, in terms of business ownership of these facilities, they typically turn over 7, 8, 9 years, and there are requirements they have for a rate of return, which is good or bad, depending on your perspective. But lost in this is the fact that it doesn't pencil for their business model, and they're not going to make steps that would benefit society. It would deal with greenhouse gases. It would help make us stronger economically, and it would help with the evolution of these techniques and products that make us more energy efficient and that ultimately add to the productivity of this country. We should have had a discussion like that before the committee, before we made some things permanent at massive cost And something like this, which I'm convinced actually pays for itself over time if we look at the big picture. I hope that we're able to have that type of conversation going forward, because clearly we've got to go back and do lots of fixing of a fatally flawed piece of legislation. We'll be dealing with that for the next Congress and beyond. But this is an area that should not be lost. We ought to understand the realities of commercial businesses, of government business, and be able to weigh the costs and benefits, not just to the owner, but to society generally. I appreciate your putting it before us. I appreciate the notion of having a continuous process of upgrading the standards, which I think makes a lot of sense. Working together, we can get more out of this process and be able to attach the appropriate priority as we go forward. I'm sorry we didn't do that with this massive multi-trillion-dollar bill and all its warts and running sores that we'll be looking at. But this is one that ought not to be punished. I hope we can take the time to understand it, to be able to weave it into a broader context as we spend a significant amount of time over the next two Congresses trying to fix this flawed bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Mr. Renacci, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm actually very appreciative of the panel being here and us discussing some of these credits and issues even after we've passed the tax bill. I think it's important. I was a businessman. I'm a CPA. Many times you make decisions and then you look and continue to evaluate it. I wish we would have done that more on the Affordable Care Act and evaluated many of the decisions made there and learned from panels like this. So I appreciate you being here. I'm a strong proponent of the all-above approach when it comes to energy policy. I also support exploring, developing, and producing domestic energy in an environmentally responsible manner. But I do want to focus on one bunch of credits. Mrs. Jacobson, I agree that our tax code is currently structured in a manner that puts otherwise competitive technology at a disadvantage in the marketplace. I'm never a believer that government should be picking winners and losers. With technologies like fuel cells, small wind, and geothermal already having an extension through 2021, technologies like biogas, biomass, hydropower, and waste-to-energy aren't currently competing on a level playing field. We need to do something to put these competing technologies on an even plane with each other. I also understand that the credits at issue are configured differently and may need some reconciliation, so these competing technologies are treated similarly as the credits are ultimately phased out. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that and my concerns and maybe what we can do to address that?
Thank you very much, Congressman. And I think very much appreciate you understanding the broader dynamics and the differentiation in the treatment of different technologies and industries within the tax code in the energy sector. I think I would start by speaking a little bit about Representative Stefanik's legislation, which aims at addressing what you just described. Again, it's H.R. 4137, the Renewable Electricity Tax Credit Equalization Act, and it aims to kind of bring, more equity and address the technologies that right now, basically are at a competitive disadvantage. So we've seen what stable long-term policy in the energy sector can do. Just in the last year, the end of 2017, we saw 18 gigawatts of renewable energy generation come online in this country, which is now we're at 18% total generation for the renewable energy sectors. That includes hydropower, of course. So we are now almost on par with our national nuclear fleet. I mean, that is an astonishing accomplishment. And what drove the last several years of growth in renewable energy has largely been in the areas of wind and solar because of the enactment of the PATH Act at the end of 2015, which gave a long-term extension. So those industries have been able to create jobs, attract investment, scale at a very significant rate, and it's because investors had a long runway consistent with their business cycles, and that's all we'd like to see for all renewable technologies.
Sure. Well, the one thing in closing, and I know my time's out, I do like to see simplification and phasing out of all these, but at the same time, they have to be able to compete as they do phase out. So thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Corbello, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank all of the witnesses for being here today. Energy efficiency is the quickest, most affordable, and easiest way to extend energy supplies, reduce carbon emissions, while simultaneously improving the bottom line for businesses. When you waste less energy, you consume less of it. This helps the environment and operating margins. It's estimated that without the gains in energy efficiency made since 1973, today's U.S. economy would consume 60% more energy than we currently do. Mr. Lazio, you know a little bit about politics, and I want to ask you to expand somewhat on the point made by my colleague, Mr. Blumenauer, on the multiplier effect, the big picture, and perhaps the ability of this provision and this concept to really bring Republicans and Democrats together, because I do see major gains and advantages that both sides really support when it comes to this provision that promotes energy efficiency. I'd like to give you the opportunity to take a wide lens here and give us your perspective.
Thank you, Congressman. Yeah, I do believe this is one of those provisions where Republicans and Democrats can address their core values and find an area where they come together. We're lowering the cost for government. We're helping taxpayers. We're providing for energy efficiency. For those who believe in the threat of carbon, one of the best ways of doing that is to reduce the energy efficiency in commercial buildings, which I mentioned before. 36% of all electricity consumed in America flows through commercial buildings, 20% of all energy. So on so many different fronts, this is a win for whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, whether you're a conservative or you're a liberal. The issues that are addressed through 179D, particularly this provision, Section 4, which deals with public buildings, is a huge win. It's helping people that are underserved. It's helping school districts. It's helping businesses grow America. The lower the operating costs for a particular business or for a school district or for a government building, the more money that you have to invest in a more productive, more competitive way. And that's what we all want. We want a more competitive America. We want more and better jobs. We want better schools. We want our children to get better access to better cutting-edge technologies. We want our energy lower and our dollars greater. And that's exactly what 179D does.
Thank you, Mr. Lazio, and I agree with you. I think this is a very narrow provision that has broad benefits for our country and for our society. So I thank, again, the chairman and the committee for shining a light on this. Yield back.
Thank you. Let me just say, you know, a lot of us have a different background. I've been in business 30 years, and, you know, so these whole concept of extenders make no sense. I mean, because of the uncertainty that it creates. So our goal here, the bill that we passed, I think does a lot of good things personally. But the other side, we're going to continue to work on it, improve it. That's why we've got this process going today. I think we'd like to get as many of these extenders as we can, either permanent law or get them out, frankly. I think that's on both sides of the aisle here. But I got to ask the panel this question. Corporate tax cuts for 43%. Pass-throughs, when you add it up, are 25. You got full expensing. Not permanent, but that's something, you know, for the next 4 or 5 years is very, very significant. Why do you need this extender based on the new tax law? And I'd like to have you take a few seconds each, or if someone wants to answer it, a couple of you. So the question I'm trying to think, as a business guy for a long time, I think it's been more than generous. I mean, our goal was to try to grow the economy from 1.5% to ideally 3%, create more jobs. But I have to ask all of you, why is it when you get these kind of deductions, do you need more?
If I can, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, thank you. Well, in the case of 179D and that's subsection 4 that I'm talking about, as positive as the outcomes were with respect to the tax bill and that was recently signed by the president, and you've just outlined some of them, that did not help public entities, right? So public entities continue to have the issue of finding a way to lower their operating costs to become more energy efficient. The best way to do that is to help designers who often can't bill this out. So this is an unbillable cost.
Let me say, when you say a public entity, just so we're clear,
yes.
Are you talking about a C corporation?
No, I'm talking about a government, so I'm
Okay,
talking about
okay.
a
I just wanna
state,
make sure.
state, local, or federal building. So those buildings that are energy inefficient, the best way to get them more efficient and to improve the operating costs that ultimately helps the taxpayers and the federal government in terms of subsidies, as I outlined before, is really to provide these incentives for designers to focus their time
So the
on these
companies are
bids.
getting the benefits, right?
Pardon me?
The companies are getting the tax benefits, right?
The private designers are getting the benefits.
Okay. Are they making money?
Well, on government buildings, they're often making less when they're competing for RFPs. Many of them have lower margins than they would
My
on
point
some of
is
the
if
commercial
they're
buildings.
making money and they're successful, and sometimes you don't make money right away if it's a startup or something, we all know that, it takes a couple of years or whatever. But if they're profitable and they're making money, I don't know why they need the additional incentive, and I would say that to anybody on the panel here. Especially if you look at big public companies or others, if they've got such a big tax cut, or if they're a pass-through or something, they're getting a lot of consideration on the new tax reform. We have to pay the bills up here too, and we're going to have a panel later talk about deficit spending, which we've created $10 trillion in the last 10 years. So we have to take a hard look at all this stuff. Is anybody else like to?
I mean,
Mr.
for us,
Passell?
we sit in that other category as a coalition. The tax bill that passed was.
Can you speak up a little bit, please?
We sit in a different place as members of our coalition. The tax bill that was passed was incredible for American businesses and industry, but as a group of American businesses that are still subscale in an emerging industry, nobody in our coalition is profitable yet as we continue to build sort of this next generation of 2 and 3.
Kind of a new industry, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So for us, a fantastic tax bill that was passed, but we aren't seeing the benefits yet, and there's an opportunity to help us create the next great American industry.
Okay. Ms. Jacobson?
Thank you. I mean, from what I was describing, really there are a number of industries that are a competitive disadvantage given the patchwork of energy-related tax measures in the code right now.
Okay. But in your, folks that you work with, if they're making $10 million a year or something, I just don't see.
Well, they're inhibited in the
I'm not saying they
marketplace
are, but
because they can't get their projects financed. I mean, as I described, they can't get PPAs. They're not as competitive to banks. I mean, we can get you more information, but there are significant competitive disadvantages here. So we have an inequitable system. They're not able to compete on a level playing field.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. 2 of the tax credits I mentioned do not flow to businesses. They flow to homeowners, 25C and 45L. Those tax credits encourage the installation of high-efficiency equipment and other measures, and that helps lower homeowner utility bills, which I think is important and is one of the higher costs of homeownership over time. These tax credits also provide certainty, but this time it's to the contractors, which are the local workforces that incorporate the availability of credits into their sales strategies, which is important. If the credits are available or not available on a year-to-year basis, it just makes it harder to sort of close the sale at the kitchen table, which is kind of the anecdote. And then finally, I mentioned S1068, which is Senator Wyden's bill. That also proposes this performance-based approach. And what that does is it encourages a more holistic approach to energy efficiency, because when you make heating and cooling as well as thermal envelope improvements and structural improvements, you actually compound the benefits and savings.
Mr. Jacob.
And Congressman, I would say even with increased capital, when you have a long-term payback, it's hard to get owners to focus their capital on energy efficiency projects. When you have the capital and we were able to bridge it like this, we're going to do good business. There is a long-term return to the owner, but there's also a great return to the communities in terms of efficiency, dealing with peak loads and all the rest.
I'm going to be looking at, if you're getting substantial benefit, I don't know that you are, startup industries might be a little different, but I've got a question. I'm going to be questioning if someone's making a lot of money and taking advantage of the current code, new tax code. I've got to ask that question. The other question, we don't have enough time, I want you to think about, or maybe send me a note or something. What are you willing to give up, if anything, to get the consideration that you're looking for? And so we don't have enough time to get into that, but I do want to just, something I want you to think about, and if you could let me know, if anything, what would your industry or yourselves be willing to give up to get the consideration to make it permanent? And so just in closing, thank you for your chance to come and visit today. We appreciate the opportunity, especially you, Congressman. So again, thank you, and we'll move on to the next panel.
President, when you're done.
I'd like to welcome our second panel as we turn to expired tax incentives for alternative fuel and vehicles. Excuse me. First, we'll hear from Drew West, founder and chief executive officer of American Natural Gas, LLC. Second, we'll hear from Don Gates, president of NGV America. Third, we'll hear from Stuart Weedie, president and CEO of the Blossom Companies. Fourth, we'll hear from Michael Duncan, the Director of Sales and Marketing for RES Polyflow. Fifth, we'll hear from Robbie Diamond, President and CEO of Security American Futures. Finally, we'll hear from Maury Markowitz, President of Fuel Cells and Hydraulic Energy Association. Thanks again for being here today with us. The committee has received your written statements, and they will be made part of the formal hearing record. Each of you will be recognized for 3 minutes for your oral remarks. We're trying to keep this moving along. Mr. West, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Every time we take a diesel truck and convert it to natural gas, we're taking the equivalent of removing 350 cars from our roads from an emissions perspective. That's tremendous impact. I drove down here from upstate New York, Saratoga Springs. I'm the founder and CEO of American Natural Gas. We design, build, own, and operate CNG stations around the country. We currently have 40 stations in 13 states. I drove a compressed natural gas vehicle because I was inspired in 2011 when I first saw a Honda Civic with 80,000 miles, and I looked at the tailpipe, and not only was it clean to the touch, it was clean to the eye. When we think about the issues plaguing our country, it's healthcare, and emissions are a big contributor of that, particulates, as well as the environment. Compressed natural gas vehicles are a technology that are here today, and we're very different than a lot of other tax credits. Our tax credits benefit our customer base. We pass those on in the forms of reduced fueling costs and direct benefits to those customers. So I'm here on behalf of those customers that are ready to make the commitment with parity with hydrogen, electric, and other alternative fuels that have long-term credits in place. I have commitments from the best fleets around the country, small and large, that are willing to make that commitment. We believe that this is also a sustainable industry. When we reach scale, this industry can operate with the 5-year extension of an AFETC. We can operate without further subsidies. We've come a long way. If you look at the transition from diesel to compressed natural gas, or from gasoline to diesel, it was a multi-decade process. It took 20 years. We're here today. We've made so much progress given the support since 2006, but it wasn't until 2013 that we had a dedicated engine that met the need for the over-the-road Class 8 vehicles. And that was a critical timing point for us. So we're ripe today. We're at a tipping point, and we can't forget our drivers. Let's not let them go back smelling like refineries. During Hurricane Harvey, our station was up and running. We were fueling the first relief vehicles, providing food and water for those in need. This technology relies on transportation of fuel like to your house, so you don't impact the roadways with 120,000-pound gross vehicle weight vehicles destroying our roadways, which are much in need of improvement. The other thing is, this is safe, domestic, and here today. There's a lot of other things being proposed out there, but no one else in Class 8 is hauling freight like we are today. It's here. There's challenges with electrification and other technologies. We don't have Elon Musk, and I think it's very clear that with parity, certainty, and our industry doesn't benefit from some of the tax reform, and I'll get into that later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Westbrook-Skage. You're recognized for 3 minutes.
Chairman Buchanan, Ranking Member Doggett, distinguished members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity today. I'm Dan Gage, representing Natural Gas Vehicles for America. We're a 200-plus member organization dedicated to the development of growing a profitable and sustainable marketplace for vehicles powered by natural gas, but also using more natural gas in off and on-road transportation. Like Mr. West, we are in support of a 5-year extension of the alternative fuel credit found in IRC 6426, 6427, and also the alternative fueling infrastructure credit found in IRC 30C. 74% of heavy-duty trucks on America's roads today are not certified to the latest EPA emission standards, 74%. Yet heavy-duty vehicles like short and long-haul trucks, refuse trucks, school transit buses, they're the fastest growing segment of U.S. transportation in terms of energy use and emissions. They're major emitters of diesel particulate matter, greenhouse gases, and smog-forming pollutants like nitrogen oxide, or NOx. Anyone who's driven behind an old diesel truck has experienced this up close and firsthand. And while HDVs total 7% of all vehicles on our roads, they account for 33% of America's smog precursor emissions from mobile sources and 20% of all transportation-related greenhouse gases. Why this is important? According to the EPA, 125 million Americans reside in areas of exceedingly poor air quality. They call them non-attainment areas. And almost 40% of the U.S. population lives in communities that has dangerous smog-causing pollutants. And breathing in these particular pollution increases the risk of asthma, lung cancer, heart disease, premature death. Heavy-duty trucks are the #1 source of those urban emissions. The simple truth is, if we want cleaner air, we need cleaner trucks, and we need federal incentives like these credits to encourage the replacement of aging, dirty fleets with clean, zero-emission equivalent natural gas powertrains. So we at NGVA believe that every child in America can and should awaken a neighborhood with clean air by 2025, and natural gas gets us there. Mr. West spoke a little bit about some of those benefits. Natural gas vehicles are sustainable. The newest natural gas engines with zero emissions equivalent technology produce 90% fewer NOx emissions than the standard. The cleanest heavy-duty truck engine in the world is powered by natural gas, and when it's powered with renewable natural gas, it has 115% fewer greenhouse gas emissions. Natural gas vehicles are responsible. As a domestic fuel, its increased use grows the economy. Our engines, the Cummins engine is made, medium and heavy duty, are made in places like Jamestown, New York, and Rocky Mount, North Carolina. Natural gas vehicles are proven, road tested, and commercially ready right now. So I ask for your consideration of a 5-year extension for 2018 through 2022 that would offset the cost of these new cleaner burning trucks and accelerate the investment payback for consumers and job creators. Extending this alternative credit would provide some partial parity with other emerging technologies that have additional credits. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Weedi. You're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here on behalf of the National Propane Gas Association, and I'd like to briefly discuss the following 3 tax provisions that have greatly helped propane, a domestically produced alternative fuel, gain acceptance as a transportation fuel: the alternative fuel tax credit, the alternative fuel infrastructure credit, as well as the alternative fuel mixture credit. Globally, there are more than 27 million vehicles running on propane autogas. And unfortunately, in the United States, there are only approximately 220,000 vehicles, despite the clear cost, fuel cost savings and environmental benefits of propane autogas. Since the early 1970s, our nation's dependence on foreign oil has been an ongoing dilemma, but in recent years, we've come a long way towards more energy independence, but I think the more appropriate term is energy security, due to the shale gas and oil methods that have greatly increased supply. The United States is now the world's largest producer of propane, little-known fuel. It's very much a process of natural gas extraction. And in fact, we are expected to grow our supply in the United States 40% over the next decade. So we've got an abundant supply. In 2017 alone, more than 14 billion gallons of propane was exported out of our country to nations in Asia, South America, and Europe. That is enough fuel to convert more than 5.5 million government and private fleet vehicles. Since 2005, Congress has assertively acted to support our nation's desire to become more energy secure and improve emissions, and the legislation that was passed then encouraged the use of domestic fuels such as propane and natural gas, or CNG. At that time, hundreds of companies went into business and initiated businesses, and just in time, they created technology for the vehicles, refueling infrastructure, but in 2010, these incentives started to expire. And unfortunately, they've been only renewed 1 year at a time, sometimes only retroactively, which does little to stimulate future growth or market adoption. According to the Gas Technology Institute, propane reduces emissions 35% for greenhouse gases and 16 to 18% for nitrogen oxides and CO2 and others. So additionally, I would like to add that NPJ's support for an extension of the refueling credits, the refueling infrastructure credits, and the refueling mixture credits is very important in order for us to develop this market. In summary, propane and natural gas vehicles lower emissions, reduce maintenance costs. For school districts around our country who are deploying it dramatically, it's a human health benefit due to the reduction in particulate matter and soot from diesel school buses. So I urge this committee to support our energy security and cleaner air by providing future incentives.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. You're recognized.
Chairman Buchanan, Ranking Member Doggett, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Michael Dungan, and I am the Director of Sales and Marketing at RES Polyflow based in Chagrin Falls, Ohio. Today I'm here to discuss Sections 6426D and C and E of the Federal Tax Code, also known as the Alternative Fuel Tax Credit and Alternative Fuel Mixture Credit. These 50-cent per gallon tax credits accrue to retail sellers and blenders of alternative fuels. My company manufactures systems that convert post-use, non-recycled plastic into gasoline and diesel blend stocks, naphtha, and waxes. We do this via pyrolysis, which is an oxygen-free process that does not involve burning. Together with 3 other pyrolysis companies, we form the Plastics to Fuel and Petrochemistry Alliance at the American Chemistry Council to promote greater understanding and advocate on behalf of these technologies. We are a fledgling industry that is creating alternative fuels while also providing a solution for non-recycled plastic destined for landfill. Parity and fairness in the federal tax code with other renewable and alternative energy technologies is important so our industry is not at a competitive disadvantage. Providing parity for fuels derived from plastics via pyrolysis will not only deliver an alternative fuel, it will help reduce the volume of material that today's taxpayer pays to landfill. Why? Because the U.S. EPA has calculated that Americans generate over 33 million tons of plastic in our waste stream every year. Plastics are a wonderful material that help us to do more with less, but unfortunately, we currently recycle less than 10%, or about 3 million tons, and about 25 million tons of these plastics get buried and wasted. They go to landfill or worse and are at risk of being improperly managed. Recycling even greater amounts of plastic has become more challenging after China recently banned imports of many types of plastic scrap. Plastics make a particularly valuable feedstock for alternative fuels because U.S. manufactured plastics are primarily derived from natural gas, which has a very high energy content. The Earth Engineering Center at Columbia University has conservatively calculated that if the United States converted all of its landfill-bound plastics to transportation fuel via pyrolysis, these plastics could produce enough fuel to power 9 million cars for a year. There are also economic benefits. The ACC has conservatively calculated the economic impact of plastics to fuel facilities in the U.S. would generate 39,000 jobs and produce $9 billion in economic impact per year. With over 300 million tons of plastics produced globally each year, there is enormous potential to create additional jobs here in the U.S. by engineering, manufacturing, and importing these pyrolysis systems. In closing, I know there are many different opinions about the efficacy of these energy tax extenders. However, pyrolysis technologies are exactly the type of fledgling industry that smart, targeted federal tax policy can help jumpstart. Thank you for the time.
And thank you. Mr. Diamond, you're recognized.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to testify on this critical topic. I represent a nonpartisan organization committed to reducing the United States' dependence on oil for economic and national security reasons. 2006, SAFE formed our Energy Security Council, a nonpartisan group of business and military leaders that advocate for long-term policies to support this mission. The ESLC is currently chaired by Frederick W. Smith, the chairman and CEO and founder of FedEx, and General Jim Conway, the 34th Commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps. With 92% of U.S. transportation powered by oil, businesses and consumers have no alternatives available at scale when oil prices spike. And given the global nature of our oil market, a disruption anywhere impacts prices everywhere. The risks of oil dependence require some policy intervention because oil supply is determined by a cartel and traded on an opaque and an unfree oil market. Make no mistake, we remain as vulnerable to an oil supply disruption today as we were before the oil shale boom. There are 3 main policy approaches the United States should take. The first is to continue to increase our domestic oil production. The second is to maintain and modernize our unified fuel economy standards, which have served as the country's most effective response to global oil market volatility since their introduction after the first OPEC oil embargo. The third, the topic we're here to discuss today, is to provide greater fuel choice to consumers and businesses, including American-made advanced fuels like electricity, biodiesel, hydrogen, and natural gas, many of which you've heard about today. This can be accomplished through the extension of the 30C tax credit and the biodiesel tax credit. As noted, 92% of our transportation sector requires oil, and there are just no alternatives. And this oil is traded on an unfair and unfree market controlled by people who do not like us. Extending the credit for alternative fuel infrastructure under 30C is important to diversifying this transportation fuels and maximizing the investments our country has made to date. Extending 30C will increase fuel choice for consumers and businesses, expand research and development, increase investment in infrastructure, and encourage policy changes at the state and local level. Also critical is the ability for American innovators to have a minimum amount of certainty regarding these credits. The biodiesel tax credit illustrates this point well, but it applies to all these other credits. Extending the BTC for only short periods of time and often retroactively casts greater uncertainty into the market, rather than providing assurances. When biodiesel producers don't know the future of the tax credit, they are forced to gamble on whether or not they think it will be passed. This stifles innovations and pushes off the day when this domestic fuel can fully compete. Certainty is as important as tax credits themselves. Diversifying our transportation fuel helps to reduce the need to import oil. The U.S. has spent $2.5 trillion on imported oil in the last 10 years. Two-thirds of that has flowed directly to OPEC members. We should celebrate the benefits from recent increases in domestic production, but not be lulled into a false sense of security. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Diamond. Mr. Markowitz, you're recognized.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. The member companies that make up FCHEA range in size from Fortune 100 companies to small businesses and startups. Our members currently employ tens of thousands of employees and workers in the United States. My comments will focus on two items: the fuel cell vehicle tax credit found in Section 30B, and the alternative fuel vehicle refueling property credit found in Section 30C. That sent a strong signal to the private industry that the federal government was committed to help alleviate initial market barriers by providing consumer credits for zero-emission vehicles and help industry comply with federal CAFE standards and state mandates concerning ZEVs. Automobile manufacturers and industrial gas companies have invested billions of dollars in fuel cells and hydrogen. Light-duty vehicles are being sold and leased in the marketplace today. So, why fuel cell electric vehicles? Because it is the only zero-emission vehicle technology out there now and for the foreseeable future, the next 5-10 years, that totally replicates the current driver's experience of being able to drive 300 to 400 miles on a tank full of fuel, but equally important to be able to refuel it in 3 to 5 minutes. Plus, it has the added advantage of being scalable. You can power a car from a subcompact to a full-size SUV to a full-size bus to medium and heavy-duty trucks. In other words, fuel cell vehicles offer American consumers the option of zero emissions, zero compromise. Unfortunately, the tax code is currently aligned to skew customer choice by offering a tax credit for one ZEV technology and not another. We believe that the best tax policy is one that is technology neutral. We ask that you extend 30B and 30C provisions in order to level the playing field. You may ask, why is this in the best interest of American people? My answers are simple. One, this American-developed technology, which, by the way, helped us get a man on the moon, will enable us to transfer our transportation sector's use of foreign oil to domestic production, thanks to the fact that hydrogen can be derived from fossil fuels such as natural gas to renewables, keeping our national wealth here. Two, keep America competitive. As the world moves to vehicle electrification, equal footing will not only send clear signals to consumers, but to automobile manufacturers, and will keep us competitive in the global marketplace. Three, smart tax policy. A technology-neutral approach will be a simple, fair, and allow consumers more choice. Four, it will allow automobile manufacturers to meet upcoming state, federal, and international mandates. Five, the cost will be modest when weighed against the benefits. Six, the 30C provision is important for the build-out of the necessary infrastructure to fuel the growing fleet of fuel cell vehicles. In closing, we feel our industry is capable of great things, but we need to be able to compete on equal footing with other technologies, with the eye to always letting the consumer be the ultimate decider in the marketplace. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank all of you for your testimony. We'll now proceed to questions and answer session. I will defer my question at the end of the question period. I now recognize Mr. Rice.
Thank you, sir. My first question is to Mr. West and Mr. Gage. When I was running for Congress the first time in 2012, a constituent brought me to a natural gas, I think it was a compressed natural gas service station in Dillon, South Carolina, right on 95. It was a Flying J station. It had cellophane wrapped around it. And I think they said Boone Pickens built it like every 300 miles along the interstate. Today, that thing's still wrapped in cellophane. Why is that? Turn your microphone on.
Sorry, back in 2011, there was a sort of a debate whether LNG or compressed natural gas would be the fuel of choice. The clean energy natural gas highway that Boone Pickens supported was for LNG facilities. They started down the path of developing those facilities. They never commissioned them because basically the engine manufacturers in 2013 came out with a dedicated engine for compressed natural 12-liter engine that fit Class 8 vehicles' needs. So they sunset the production of most LNG engines, and that basically made those stations useless. Compressed natural gas is the clear choice, and it's
okay. Thank you. Now, these energy tax incentives that we're talking about here, pretty much all of them came in effect in 2005, right? Mr. Gage, why did they come into effect in 2005?
Well, they were part of the of a larger bill that
Yeah,
passed.
but why do we need that bill?
Well, in advance at the time in 2005, we were looking to get. There was a big push for energy independence, right?
Why was that?
Foreign oil. I'm sorry?
Why was that?
Well, we had a huge look at conflicts in the
What
Middle
was
East.
oil per barrel at that time?
I don't know, sir.
$140 a barrel.
Well over 100, and now it's.
And we were still operating under what they call peak oil theory. You know what peak oil theory is? It said we discovered all our recoverable oil, and that we weren't going to find any more, and that oil was going to keep going up in price. Mm-hmm. So we had to incentivize domestic fuels, right? I mean, we were trying to be energy independent. You know what oil costs a barrel today?
60.
$60 a barrel.
Yes, sir.
And do you know the estimate of onshore fuel that we have now? How many years of onshore fuel we have today in America?
I know we have a 90-year supply of recoverable natural gas.
90 years. So, you know, the purpose of these fuel tax credits was, oh my goodness, we're completely subject to our enemies. Mr. Diamond, you said just as subject today as we were in 2005. I think that's absolutely untrue. In fact, we're producing more oil now in the United States than we ever have, and we've got almost 100 years worth of proven recoverable supplies. So I'm just struggling to understand why we still need to provide this level of incentive.
If I could answer that.
Can I respond to the dependence question?
If I could just answer your question of why we need that. For us, it's parity. It's not about finding new fuel sources. It's about turning fleets over to this cleaner technology. And currently, we don't have parity with, as an example, the electric drive folks. The economics just don't make sense. And so while you're asking why stations may have been built 5, 6, 7 years ago and not open, we don't have the number of fleets to make the numbers work on paper.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Doggett, for any question he might have.
Well, thank you very much. I believe that natural gas is a very important transition fuel to get us to a cleaner place. We've had a significant increase in the availability of natural gas, and much of it is due to what is happening in Texas. I have ridden on the buses of VIA at the San Antonio public transportation system. I know they've invested in some of these vehicles, and I'm interested in protecting their investment and seeing us move to cleaner fuels, particularly in what is a near non-attainment area in both Austin and San Antonio. At the same time, I see this tax credit as being rather expensive. It's over $555 million per year, and I want to understand it better. As I understand it, all of you are saying, give it to us for another 5 years and we'll be fine. Is that, in essence, the testimony?
My testimony is that we're asking for a 5-year extension.
And you won't be asking for 6.
Well,
5 years is sufficient.
When you look at how other alternative powertrains, the light duty does not currently, light duty electric does not have a sunset.
Well, so are you saying after 5 years you'll be back asking for 5 more if they have it?
We're asking for a 5-year extension.
And you say the 5-year extension won't lead to any new discoveries. It will simply put you on a more equal playing field with electric vehicles.
To convert more and more fleets over to natural gas from currently diesel. Remember, biodiesel, the biodiesel credit's $1. We're half of that.
Let me be sure I understand this, the GGE, the gasoline equivalent. Can you tell me what percentage of that credit is passed on to consumers?
I could probably better answer that if that's okay.
Fine.
In whether it's reduced price at the pump or some sort of rebate back to them,
right.
100% of it. We're investing in new stations. Without these tax credits, we're just going to stop building infrastructure, and we're at that tipping point. This is a critical time to support the investments we've made. And like I said, diesel took 20 years to convert. It's critical timing now.
So no part of the credit goes to expanding capital expenditures for natural gas extraction.
This credit is with fuelers and for fuelers and consumers.
And you're saying 100% of it flows to the consumer?
Generally, it's a consumer credit.
Okay.
I can speak to the propane auto gas in the United States. 100% goes to the consumer, the fleet operator that's running their business or their government fleet every day. And just want to add that the third most widely used fuel is propane. It's slightly ahead of natural gas globally. Here we're sort of like the stepchild. It doesn't get much attention, but we do have a prominent place in the market, particularly in Class 6, 7 vehicles and lower.
And if I understand, Mr. Dungan, you have really kind of the same argument Mr. Gage has about, as regards electric. You're saying that unless you can cover this plastics to fuel, you're at a disadvantage relative to natural gas.
That is correct. We're asking to be listed as a...
Do you know how much it would cost to list you, expand the credit?
We're going through an economic study right now with ACC.
You'll get that to us.
Provide that to you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Mr. Larson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I find this question interesting. It's that old saying, I'm going to ask some rapid questions about, I hate to be biblical, but everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. When we look at this tax bill, of course, and we see the enormous amount of debt that we're putting on the American people, when you really look at it, it's about $2.3 trillion. So in essence, when we're talking to you, we're asking you and you're saying, hey, look, we should be included. There's got to be fairness and equity within all of this. And I note some very far-sighted thinkers, most notably Senator Lindsey Graham, but closer to home, some real radicals like Jim Baker, George Shultz, Martin Feldstein, Greg Mankiw, Hank Paulson, Elon Musk, Gary Cohn, Kevin Hastert, Rex Tillerson, and Art Laffer have said that they would favor a carbon tax because they feel that this will generate the kind of revenue-neutral monies that we need so that we can take care of some of the emerging concerns that so many of your industries have. Would you support a carbon tax? Mr. West?
In conjunction with this or separate?
In conjunction with.
Certainly.
Mr. Gage?
I have to take that back to our membership.
Take it back to your membership?
I would have a difficult time supporting a carbon tax unless it was going to be applied equally across the board, and if it's so, it should be based on the carbon intensity of the fuels, and natural gas and propane auto gas are very low.
And if it was, would you support it?
I'm not particularly excited about additional taxes.
So you want to go to heaven, but you don't want to pay to get there. I get it. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Duncan.
We'd certainly support looking into that, and again, carbon intensity in our view is an important
Mr. Diamond.
Yeah, we've supported a gas tax in the past because it is true that we shouldn't pick winners and losers, and it's the best way to do it. But unfortunately, the government has been unwilling to put the fair price on the externalities and then let the market choose. But seeing that we're not willing to do that, we should definitely have these
According to
tax
Mr.
credits.
Baker, Mr. Schultz, and Mr. Feldstein and others, this produces about $1.8 trillion. The tax bill was $1.5 trillion, but when you look at all the costs that added to it, it ends up being a cost to the American taxpayer of about $2.3 trillion. I'm a strong supporter and the head of the one of the co-chairs of the fuel cell. What are other nations doing with respect to fuel cell automobiles, Mr. Markowitz?
Well, I'd like to tell you that they are actively involved in not only the manufacturing but the deployment of vehicles. In the EU, especially in Germany, Netherlands, there's a growing government support for the build-out of infrastructure and in the support of the purchase of the vehicles. As an example, in Denmark, you know that's a very heavy tax.
I thank you for that, but I just wanted to add, because I know my time's running out, so I think it's safe to say that you all want to make sure that you get part of the equity that's involved in a major tax cut, but nobody wants to pay for it.
Mr. Blumenauer, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate having this panel walk us through a variety of aspects of our transportation and technology policies that aren't necessarily congruent. They face some short-term and intermediate-term challenges. There are issues about parity, the application of new technology, and how it relates to other competitors in the marketplace. Each one appears to be a little different, and I look forward to being able to understand better the implications of what you're talking about. This is part, though, of a bigger picture that I hope our committee is able to deal with. It's not just parity, winners and losers, how we accelerate technology implementation, but we are facing a transportation crisis in this country. We're not paying enough now to support our transportation infrastructure, and many of these we haven't raised the gas tax in 25 years, and many of these technologies are disruptive in the short term because they're not paying into a trust fund that is woefully inadequate and getting worse. And broader applications of some of the technologies are going to accelerate that. I mean, self-driving cars are all going to be electric. How do we maintain the infrastructure of today while we finance the infrastructure of tomorrow and be able to have the technological applications that are necessary to have cleaner, more efficient vehicles, cleaner air, and be able to have a position of strength when we deal with our energy future. I was disappointed when the chairman of our committee said he was interested that the Transportation Infrastructure Committee had a hearing on paying for our infrastructure, and he was looking forward to hearing their recommendations. That's our responsibility. And I would hope that we could incorporate what we're hearing today with the broader picture of how we pay for America's transportation, where we're falling apart and we're falling behind. I would hope that we would have a week or two of hearings that allow us to deal with issues of parity and application, but also how do we keep the system going? What are the essential elements of infrastructure that we, not just the roads and bridges, but there are fueling issues for all of these technologies that are in the intermediate term are going to require some sort of public support to be able to come to scale and take advantage of it. And I hope, Mr. Chairman, that that's an opportunity that we could have a broader conversation amongst ourselves, not wait for some other committee to handle our jurisdiction, because these are very significant subjects that I think are worthy of our debate and maybe even taking some action. Thank you very much.
And thank you. I'm going to just go to some questions, and I guess the big thing, you know, these extenders, our goal is to try to improve on what we did. The bill's not perfect. There's more work to be done. That's why we're trying to deal with extenders. You know, I've been in business 30 years before I got here. I can't imagine having to wait on an extender. You might get it, might not get it at the end of the year. Many times it rolls into January. It makes no sense. So our goal, frankly, is to see, you know, how many extenders do we need to consider going forward? Or if they make so much sense, is maybe they become part of permanent law. But I guess that what I would ask all of you quickly is why? If you're in a profitable industry, if your business is profitable, Corporations got a 43% tax cut. Pass-through entities, which a lot of them are smaller businesses, maybe the propane dealers or whatever, they're a pass-through entity. They got 25% when you added up tax cut. You got full expensing. If you're in the business where you got to buy trucks, you can write it all off, 100%. So the question is, why do you need more tax incentives? Because we do need to pay the bills. The next panel is going to talk about America's going broke. We've had $10 trillion in debt in the last 10 years, roughly. Plenty of blame to go around on that. But the bottom line, why is it that you need these additional incentives or tax breaks or consideration? And that's what we're all looking at. It's not even a Democrat, Republican. Really, both sides, I think we somewhat agree on this. If it's that good, let's put it in maybe permanent law and consider it. But I got to believe a lot of these things we have to take a hard look at. How much is enough? And I'm not referring to just you, just in general. Because, we have a lot of public companies were paying 35. Now they're paying 21, 43% cut. They're competitive in the world. But I don't know why we need additional incentives. They've got plenty of incentives. So maybe your business is different, your industry is different. I'd be the first to admit I don't know everything about your industry. So I just posed that question to you. When you look at what the new tax law is doing starting January 1 of this year, the benefits that you're going to take advantage of, why do you need this? And Mr. West, maybe you can talk to the industry or if you represent your company.
Outside of the parity, clarity, and certainty argument, we're emerging since 2013 with a dedicated engine to fuel our technologies and to push this NGVs to the next level. Class 8 vehicles are going to work, and our businesses have 20-year investment horizons on the infrastructure component. So we don't have public money like Tesla and $1.5 billion commitments like electric does per company. So we're looking at this to incentivize our customer base to adopt this technology. That's why we asked for 5 years. We do pay federal excise tax credits at state and federal levels, so we do pay tax liabilities to fund the roadways. And electric vehicles, Weights and Measures hasn't even come up with a unit measure for it. So it's because this isn't going to big companies that are very profitable. This is an emerging bunch of people in the value chain that are building out this great technology, and we're at that tipping point. So I really do believe.
And I realize I don't know the background of all the companies here, industries being represented.
There's a lot like us.
But I'd like to, get that sense of it. The industries that I've been involved in, we make money. And I think there's been more than enough consideration. I think it's been more than fair with companies across America. But again, it might be different.
Can I speak to the national security economic point of this? So oil is a special...
Everybody will get a minute or so, but go ahead, Mr. Diamond. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say that oil is a special commodity, right? So first of all, we're 100% dependent. It's traded by a cartel. So in 2014, so the price is actually in 2005 $60. China starts using so much more, it drives to $147, driving our auto industry into bankruptcy, goes down to $20 because of the recession, then starts going up because shale, and Saudi Arabia decides to flood the market in 2014, which drives 200,000 jobs out of the oil patch. So if you're a company and you're dealing with oil, it is a very different type of thing, and that is then a national security risk. So we might produce more oil today. Have we changed one thing in our 6th, 7th fleet? We haven't changed anything. We're still paying for that. Two is there's a chicken and egg problem with all the industries here.
Let me say one thing. When I got here 10 years ago, it was all about how are we going to get off foreign oil. Mm-hmm. We've come a long way, in a sense, my understanding, in the last 10 years.
So I'm all for domestic production, but there is a global price, and that price is volatile. And what they decide in Vienna as a cartel would be illegal in the United States of America, and they're doing it all the time and telling us they're doing it. So these people are fighting a battle with their hands behind their back, because at a time when even they can deploy, the price could be dropped because Saudi Arabia floods the market. So I just think that oil is unique because it powers the global economy. It's 92% our transportation system. There's no other alternative. But two, there's a chicken and egg problem. So everyone here has a problem because they're dealing with an incumbent, once again, very volatile and not traded in a free market. but also they need infrastructure and they need the vehicles. So if you need that chicken and egg problem, you need infrastructure incentives to help drive the infrastructure, then people buy the vehicles. So I think it's unique to buildings, which we just heard about, because there is this sort of dual sides of this equation.
Okay, I'm going to give everybody about a minute if you want a minute or so, because we've got a time frame here, but whatever, Mr. Duncan, anybody take a minute, whatever you want.
Thank you. To answer your question directly, Chairman Buchanan, I represent an early stage company in an emerging industry, and we look at this as a way to continue to propel innovation. Two of our companies in the U.S. are based in Ohio. One is based in Oregon. We just had legislation passed in Florida to allow the permitting to change for our type of facilities. This is a way to de-risk these startup companies and get us up on our feet. And maybe in 5-6 years, we don't need this support anymore. We're just asking to participate.
Is it the way for you to attract capital? Is that part of it?
It de-risks us from an off-take perspective, so our fuels that we produce are more attractive to the petroleum industry.
Thank you.
Very briefly, if we want to be more energy secure and we want to have cleaner air, these alternative options make a lot of sense, not only in the 5-year period, but perhaps beyond. And if anybody can tell us that oil's not going back to 100, I'd like to know so I can make some future transactions. From a business perspective, our company operates with alternative fuels in 45 states. Our experience is we're providing a 3-4 year payback on the investment in putting the conversion equipment on the vehicles. Unfortunately, a lot of people in this realm are only interested in a 24-month or less payback.
Well, let me ask you, that equipment that you're putting on the vehicles, and in the new tax law, can't you write it off 100% the first year now?
That'll be a benefit to the consumer, the customer, the fleet customer who's buying it. There will be a benefit there.
Isn't that a benefit to the companies that provide the service and the equipment they're adding?
The vehicles are 25% more.
Yeah.
If there are increased sales, there'll be a benefit to the providers of the technology.
But if they're making money, they're paying tax on the money, right? And they're going to get a tax reduction.
Right.
I'm just trying to, I'm telling you what I get hit with when we talk about extenders, people ask me, so.
Right. But the business decision process is usually in this type of realm, a 24 or month less payback, and that's what our experience has been while they were in place and when they have not been in place.
Mr. Gage?
I would just say very simply that there are a lot of alternative options, right, when a fleet's looking to upgrade or invest in new equipment. And for us, our members are incredibly appreciative of the tax reform. As the year progresses, they'll find out more and more just how beneficial that piece of legislation will be to them. But when they look at what alternatives are available, there isn't parity in terms of tax policy for natural gas as compared to, say, biodiesel or for electric. And that's a bottom line decision, right? It's dollars and cents, and when you can get $1 in the with biodiesel and only 50 cents for natural gas, it has an impact, and it has an impact. And our goal is to try and get these fleets to convert over to natural gas.
So when you're talking about your industry buying, did you say trucks?
Yes, sir.
How much are those trucks?
Well, it all depends. A typical Class 8 truck could cost anywhere from usually about $125,000 to $150,000.
Okay.
When you add the natural gas component, it could be another $50,000.
So they might buy 4 or 5 trucks a year?
Some of our members are very small fleets. We also represent fleets like Waste Management and UPS that are buying.
Let's say they buy 5 trucks, that's $500,000. They finance it over 10 years. So they got, 10% out of pocket, and they got a $500,000 deduction, which you're saving 25% on that. I mean, it seems like that's a pretty good benefit.
Many of our members, especially the larger members, are looking for they keep the vehicles for between 2 and 3 years. So they, as was just referenced, that return is they're looking more on a payback of between.
I would just ask all of us, because we do have to pay the bills up here too.
Yes, sir.
Is just take a look at what you're getting, and then what the incentive you're asking us to address, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure this works for the American people. We're running these massive deficits. And these are the questions that I get asked from people is on tax extenders or any other incentives. A lot of people say, haven't they got enough? Maybe not referring just to your industry, but just in general. So I think it's something you need to talk to the membership about and just ask them, because you represent a lot of different big and small, and see how badly do they need that, considering what they just are going to get, they just got. Mr. Markowitz?
Chairman, I'm going to give you a little different twist on what you're talking about. Also, some of the companies are being required by either federal or state mandates to meet certain performance standards, which requires them to build products that are transformational and new to the marketplace. But a lot of those transformational products are also very expensive or more expensive than the incumbent technology you're trying to replace. So to make this sort of technology attractive for consumers to purchase, you need sometimes that incentive to provide some sort of financial equity for the purchaser. In addition to that, what we were talking about is when you deal with transformational technologies, you shouldn't pick winners or losers. And that, for instance, I could give you a long list of products, whether it's flat screens that came out with plasma and LCD, by having just one tax break for one technology, not providing it for the other, you may be going all in on the wrong technology.
Yeah. Let me ask you, just in concluding, I'd like to have you think about this. I asked the last panel if you were here. If we were to work with you in terms of permanent law, what are you willing to give up? What is the industry willing to give up in exchange, maybe for what you're looking for today, an incentive is a possibility? It's just something, I don't have time today because we're running out of time, but send me a note or send our staff here a note and just think about that. Is there something in the industry that you're getting as an incentive? It's not much of an incentive. Maybe it was 8, 10 years ago when we went through a period of 08 and it was a disaster the next 3 or 4 years. All of us lived through that. And just take a hard look at it. So, and also just let me say thank you for your testimony. We appreciate the opportunity to work with you and continue to work with you. I would say tax reform, our goal is to try to improve on it. We want to make sure it makes sense, it's fair, and we want to make sure these extenders are permanent law. Which ones, because they won't all make it, but some of them might be considered, and that's our goal. Thank you. And let me just mention we'll adjourn now and then try to come back right after votes or 2 o'clock. So this portion is adjourned.